Okay, welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a fascinating and honestly pretty provocative text titled, Should We Fear an Islamic Government in Syria? We're going to unpack its specific historical arguments and see exactly how it challenges the prevailing modern narratives.
So, the entire source material we're looking at revolves around this one specific question. It directly challenges modern Western anxieties about the Middle East. But instead of getting bogged down in modern political theory, the author leans heavily on a massive 1,300-year historical record. They're really trying to flip the script on what an Islamic government actually means for the people living under it, especially for non-Muslim minorities.
To really get where the author is coming from, we have to look at how they frame recent events. They actually start by quoting the Quran. They planned, but Allah also planned, and Allah is the best of planners. You see, after decades of severe, deeply entrenched oppression, the sudden collapse of that Syrian regime isn't just presented here as a military shift. It's framed as a divine plan. The text emphasizes that even with global superpowers involved, from Russia and America to Israel and Iran, they simply could not stop this outcome. And that sets the stage for the core conflict in the text. I mean, the sheer geopolitical shock of this sudden victory surprised everyone, even the rebels themselves. But taking down decades of tyranny overnight creates a huge vacuum. And with that vacuum came an immediate wave of panic and intense debate in the West about what comes next. Which brings us to two wildly competing narratives. On one side, you've got immediate Western fear. We're talking Washington Post headlines panicking about Christians in Aleppo, and U.S. leaders explicitly demanding commitments to minority protections. But on the flip side, the source hits back with its primary counterargument. They argue that these fears completely ignore a 1,300-year track record where those exact minorities were explicitly protected by Islamic governance. The text is basically saying the West is demanding protections that Islamic law inherently provided for over a millennium. Let's actually look at that timeline, because it's pretty staggering. The text points out that Syria was under continuous Islamic rule from 634 all the way to 1918 CE. We're talking about massive, world-defining eras here. You've got the Umayyad Caliphate making Damascus its shining capital. You've got the Abbasid Caliphate pushing back the Crusaders. This unbroken chain of Islamic governance didn't officially end in a broader Islamic world until the Caliphate was abolished in 1924. So, the author throws out this really logical, kind of brilliant challenge to the viewer. They ask, if the modern narrative is true, if Islamic rule is inherently dangerous and intolerant to minorities, then how exactly did Christians and their ancient churches manage to continuously exist in Syria after nearly 1,300 years of living under that exact rule? And they don't just rely on Islamic scholars to answer that question. They bring in outside historical evidence. Quoting Thomas Arnold, a prominent Christian Orientalist, Arnold actually looked at the historical record and concluded, quote, of any organized attempt to force the acceptance of Islam or of any systematic persecution intended to stamp out the Christian religion, we hear nothing. To put that into perspective, Arnold makes some heavy-hitting European comparisons. He argues that the Islamic caliphs absolutely possessed the military power to wipe out Christianity if they wanted to. I mean, look at what other European states were doing at the time. Ferdinand and Isabella violently drove Islam out of Spain. Louis XIV penalized Protestants in France. England totally expelled Jewish people for 350 years. The caliphs had the exact same power, but the source argues they actively chose a path of tolerance and protection. So, the big takeaway the author's making here is that the survival of these Eastern churches wasn't just a historical accident. These communities were totally cut off from the rest of Christendom. European powers weren't swooping in to save them. The text presents the fact that these ancient churches are still standing today as tangible, physical proof of over a millennium of systemic protection. Jumping forward a bit in the timeline to the late 19th century, the narrative introduces this truly fascinating anecdote from 1876. This was during the Ottoman Tanzimat reforms, which brought in a new secular-leaning constitution. But according to the records, a Greek doctor explicitly stated that the traditional rule of Sharia was actually better for Christians. Why? Well, because that new secular constitution stripped away specific privileges Sharia had historically granted them, while suddenly forcing new obligations onto them. And, this wasn't just an isolated historical blip. Decades later, during the 1919 Syrian National Congress, right after the Ottomans were expelled, a secular government was formally proposed. And remarkably, records indicate that both Christians and Muslims stood together in strong opposition to it.
The author suggests their shared historical experience meant they favored traditional religious governance over newly imported secular models. Okay, so what does the source actually mean when they say caliphate? They're very careful to define it. It's not presented as some flawless utopia. Step 1. It's a practical state run by human beings. Step 2. Sovereignty doesn't belong to the whims of a dictator. It belongs to the Sharia. And step 3. The authority to rule derives its legitimacy directly from the people. The author strongly argues that this specific framework is vastly preferable to living under a tyrannical, secular dictator. To really hammer this home, the text ends its historical defense with a revealing quote from the Christians of Homs, spoken right as they welcomed the early Islamic army. They reportedly said, "Your rule and justice are dearer to us than the oppression that we used to suffer." The text uses this to suggest that historically, minorities didn't see the arrival of Islamic rule as a terrifying conquest, but actually as a liberating force bringing justice. Which brings us to the end of the explainer and the source's final provocative thought. By contrasting modern Western fears with 1,300 years of historical precedent, the text really forces us to reevaluate our assumptions. It asks, when looking at the history of the Middle East, what framework truly provides better justice and stability for a nation's citizens? Is it a modern secular dictatorship, or a system where sovereignty is tied to religious law? It's a massive question, but one this author believes history has already answered. Thanks so much for joining me to unpack this material. Keep asking questions, and I'll catch you next time.